Good afternoon. Welcome back. Well, it's not really afternoon. Good late morning, everybody. Welcome back. I'm delighted to be kicking off with our third roundtable of the series, which is titled The Art of Refusal and Everyday Resistance, which will be moderated for us by Jennifer Van Horn, who I will hand over to now. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. So it's a total pleasure to get to be here with you today, particularly after all the great talks we've heard and the wonderful things that I hope are ruminating in everybody's minds. I'm Jennifer Van Horn. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware in art history and history with a specialty in North American art and material culture. And I'm thrilled to get to moderate conversation with our two fantastic speakers. Both of them have coached me on their names, and I will say them both wrong anyway, but please bear with me. First, we have Yura Batsaki. Hey.
Amazing.
Executive Director and Principal Investigator at the Plant Humanities Initiative at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. And Catherine Molyneux. It was close. Okay. She is the Associate Professor of History at Vanderbilt University, also the author of Faces of Perfect Ebony, which I have to say is one of my favorite books and is a book that shaped a lot of our conversation yesterday, looking at art in the Yale Center for British Art. So I just have to bring that up early in our conversation. So we're going to be following our same general pattern. I'll have the opportunity to offer some remarks and situate us around the big themes of our panel. Then we'll break out for conversation, and then we'll have a chance to be in conversation with all of you. So I hope that lots of those ideas that will strike you as we're in conversation, you'll keep track of and bring up then. Nope, we're not on break. We're back. Okay. So when thinking about tea and resistance, it may seem strange to begin not with the infamous destruction of tea, as patriots tossed leaf-filled chest into Boston Harbor, but instead with a much smaller body of water, the 2 to 3 gallons that were heated in a tea urn or hot water urn. This tea urn was made and engraved by a London goldsmith for George Washington's adopted son, John Parke Custis, known affectionately as Jackie, upon Custis's marriage to Eleanor Calvert. And the urn bears the Custis family coat of arms. Commissioned in spring 1774, so just a few months after the Tea Party, and before Washington made his way to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress, it was intended to be the centerpiece of the new couple's domestic display. So the tea urn held hot water for a hostess to fill tea or coffee pots at the table, using that little spigot that you see at the front, and was definitely a mainstay of elite neoclassical tea equipage. After Custis died in 1781, the urn found its way back to Mount Vernon, which is George Washington's plantation on the banks of the Potomac River, just south of Alexandria, Virginia, and the site of enslavement for approximately 316 men, women, and children of African origin and descent. A sketch by the British-born and trained architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe upon his visit to Mount Vernon in July 1796 calls our attention to the centrality of a hot water urn for the Washington's tea and coffee rituals, in this case situated on Mount Vernon's famous portico and orchestrated by enslaved butler Frank Lee, who might be the Black figure Latrobe included in this sketch, though this could also be one of Mount Vernon's enslaved waiters. So the urn that Latrobe depicted is definitely not Custis's, but one of several now lost silver-plated tea urns, similarly engraved with the Washington's coat of arms. And the Washingtons ordered these just before and during the presidency. These featured in Martha Washington's famous receptions in New York and Philadelphia, reminding us of the importance of tea as ritual and of tea goods, both before, during, and after the American Revolution, for materially embodying, circulating, and cementing social and political networks of family, friendship, and nation, as we've gotten to hear about this past 2 days. Latrobe's sketch, though, with its inclusion of a Black figure, gestures toward tea's role in facilitating resistance and contestation, not only of British imperialism, but in negotiating the daily realities of enslavement and the larger promise of emancipation. So I think when we think about resistance, we often think about that as constituting open defiance or rebellion, exemplified by armed insurrection, declarations of independence, or acts of self-emancipation. But for our panel, we invite you to think about resistance more broadly, as implicating a cluster of strategies of denial, refusal, and negotiation that took place every day in domestic spaces, in gardens, fields, and woodlands, on wharves and in ships' holds. Actions that were not always intended to overturn a specific political regime or larger systems of patriarchy and racial capitalism, but were modes of survival, strategies for asserting personal and collective identities, and for seizing moments of pleasure and respite, moments for dreaming otherwise, within structures of extreme inequality. So there's a lot of scholars who have done valuable work on resistance. Just for our purposes today, I'm really thinking about Marissa Fuentes and the work of Stephanie Camp, but I know there are others who have resonated across the kind of cultural study of resistance. Resistance in this framing, and I think as it is very much already begun to evolve in our conversations, activates multiple temporalities, geologies, and ecologies, moving beyond the human and situating actions and actants in webs of relationships that stretch to the present and beyond. So to begin situating resistance in the material world of the Washington's tea ritual, I want to direct our attention to these serpentine coils of steam that Latrobe very carefully captured, bubbling and hissing from the tea urn's pierced finial. That steam reveals the urn to be a specialized piece of mobile heating equipment. Most likely, this tea urn was heated, or the water inside was heated with an internal brazier that fit within the base and held a few pieces of charcoal. And then it might have then had a copper tube that channeled the smoke and steam up the urn's body and then out through the top. As that description suggests, tea urns were temperamental. In his 1827 guide, The House Servants' Directory, free Black butler Robert Roberts called hot water urns out as being, quote, generally very expensive and easily spoiled, being, quote, apt to burn. So that idea of the necessity of care, I think focuses on enslaved persons' thermal labor and skill as critical for operating this urn, just as with all heating technologies at Mount Vernon. We can think about this urn in relationship then to something like the stove that enslaved men and boys kept burning 24 hours a day in the winter months to force warm air through a series of flues in Washington's greenhouse that kept tropical plants alive. The charcoal that once animated the urn's interior was also a product of enslaved persons' thermal work and their interrelated knowledge of Mount Vernon's forested land. So Mount Vernon's enslaved blacksmiths, Nat and George, whose surnames are unknown, transformed hardwood into charcoal, or what in the period was known as coal wood. Washington's farm managers' reports detail the days and nights that they carefully controlled kilns' fires so that the hardwood within charred but did not ignite, a process illustrated in Diderot's encyclopedia, which you see here, as well as the 12 days that enslaved woodcutters spent felling and chopping the approximately 30 to 40 cords of wood required for each of these charcoal kilns. And they, of course, had selected and logged that wood from the 4,000 acres of wooded land that made up more than half the area of Mount Vernon's total plantations. So crucially, production of charcoal we can think about as providing an opportunity for enslaved men to evade Washington's control. I've been deep in George Washington's letters over the past couple of months, and there's a very pointed letter to his farm manager that Washington writes, instructing that the, quote, axemen, and that's a group that included enslaved domestic servants from the main house, be kept employed closer to the house, quote, instead of going into the great wood, and generally as far out of sight as they can get to cut wood. So we have a sense then of producing charcoal as enabling enslaved men to assert their own personal time, to reject a prescribed work regime, to capture some of these stolen moments away from surveillance. And I'm really happy that Michael Hartman is here today because I'm really indebted to his work on thinking about surveillance at Mount Vernon. So we can think then as well about these, quote, axemen as being enmeshed in Black spaces where they could forage, hunt, assemble materials for their own use. And we can think about that being materially linked through that charcoal that fueled the steam of the tea urn. We can also think about resistance perhaps as being present in the emancipatory possibilities that overseeing everyday thermal regulation offered enslaved people at Mount Vernon. Historian Daniel Immerwahr reminds us, quote, the combustible environment offered the enslaved a uniquely powerful weapon. And he's identified several instances of attempted arson at Mount Vernon during Washington's lifetime, leading him to limit those enslaved persons who were allowed to keep fires. Of course, even charcoal could be a weapon. Later in the 19th century, John C. Calhoun's enslaved domestic servant Issy, quote, confessed to putting a large burning coal under the pillow of Calhoun's son. Heat's liberatory potential emerged most clearly at Mount Vernon after Washington's death. In his will, Washington manumitted the 123 people whom he enslaved, as opposed to those who were part of the Custis estate. Washington stipulated, however, that these persons not be manumitted until his wife's death. After an attempt by unidentified enslaved persons to, quote, set fire to Mount Vernon House, the fear that they might do so again with greater success encouraged Martha Washington to manumit those who had been promised their freedom 1 year after Washington's death. In the words of feminist media scholar Sasha Crawford Holland, quote, heat is a power relation. So as we come back to this silver tea urn, I think we can begin to think through how its heat enabled insurgents, both enslaved persons mobilizing the charcoal it once housed for moments of respite in Mount Vernon's woods, as well as those skills at thermal management that the Washingtons relied on to fuel their tea rituals, which also provided a political weapon for communal emancipation. So arson, by definition, destroys the evidence of its existence. And similarly, the boiling water, charcoal, and steam that made this silver tea urn an instrument of resistance are only ephemeral material traces. And I think ephemerality is something that hopefully will emerge in our conversation in relation to resistance. Nonetheless, I think the tea urn silver registered these everyday contests and illuminated alternative futures that those enslaved by the Washingtons brought to fruition for some. So with that, I hope being a kind of appetizer, if you will, I'm excited to think more about resistance through conversation with our outstanding panelists. So let's see. All right. Venture over.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that wonderful inspiration and continuing from your matter and materiality, and also this emphasis on the plant. What we agreed we would do is also jump forward in time and engage with some contemporary artists who center the plant as a way to think about the tea plant, but also plants more broadly as cultural agents in the conversations we've been having. And I started with observation that plants are everywhere in the museum space, upstairs. It seems like every weekend I see another exhibition that centers plants, whether it's living plants or herbarium specimens. So plants at different stages of liveliness. And it might be worth speculating for the reasons that contemporary artists are so obsessed with plants, because they speak to some of the afterlives of the processes that we've been talking about over the last several hours and since yesterday. And I just wanted to tease out maybe three to start off before we got into the images, which is these histories of modernity that are so bound up with the movement of plants and the voluntary or involuntary movement of people that accompanied plant transfers, and the way those processes of uprooting and transplantation of capitalism and commodification and the plantation system that emerged from them transformed societies and ecosystems. So plants are a very potent window for kind of tracing these processes historically and transhistorically. And then, and this came up a little bit this morning as well, the way in which botany is a paradigmatic science of modernity, in the way that Western practices of observation, taxonomy, botanic gardens, herbaria, conditioned and sort of initiated some of the ways in which a natural world has been understood, and living entities like plants have been decontextualized rather, and rendered inert in order to enter into these systems of circulation and calculation. So there's a whole epistemic aspect of botany and the practices that accompanied it that we saw in botanical illustrations, that we will see also in the Wardian case that I have here. And then the last thing that I was thinking about in terms of the naming of our panel, plants are as commodities are quite idiosyncratic, because they're both inert raw materials and living entities. And Romita alluded to that already with the tea plant, that have their own life cycle that shapes the ways humans can interact with them and manipulate them. And that also perhaps creates sites of resistance, since you're dealing with something that has its own agency and its own biological being. So these are, I think, some of the reasons why contemporary artists who are interested in the environmental and human toll of those processes of capitalism and commodification are engaging with plants. And this is one image that we wanted to start with, because it continues from the reference to the Wardian case that came up yesterday with the image from Ellis. And what are we looking at on the right? This is an installation by an artist, Kapwani Kiwanga, who's Canadian-French, working mostly out of Paris. She's trained as a cultural anthropologist, and she's one of those research artists who tap into the archive and draw from the archive in their practice. And the title of the work, which was installed on the High Line, it was there in 2023, 2024, is called On Growth, and is really an explicit reference to the Wardian case that you see on the left, which was invented by Nathaniel Backshaw Ward in around 1829, and then published in this work that you see an image from, On the Growth of Plants in Closely Glazed Cases. So I just wanted to zoom in a little bit on the image, and I hope everyone can sort of jump in, and you also who are engaging with this from the audience. It's a glass container, glass and metal container, that contains a metallic fern. The artist originally wanted to create the fern from stone, but it was very complex and very expensive. So we end up with this metal specimen in the case. The story and the way it relates to tea is as follows. Ward, in the early 19th century, was one of those fern enthusiasts. So we are in the context of the 19th century pteridomania or fern craze, and people are collecting ferns, are growing ferns. It was extremely difficult to keep his ferns alive in the London of the Industrial Revolution because of the soot and the coal smoke. He was a naturalist and an amateur naturalist, as well as a surgeon. And in the course of an experiment where he wanted to observe the hatching of a moth, he enclosed the pupa in a glass bottle with some soil and a little bit of water. You may know the story. And instead of the moth, what he found growing there after several weeks was a fern and some blades of grass. And so he discovered this principle that plants can survive without water in enclosed containers. And so we have this mini greenhouse or terrarium that emerges from this experiment. And it goes two ways that speak to the discussions we've been having about domesticity and intimacy, and then commodities and scale. Because on the one hand, this becomes the terrarium that you see in Victorian drawing rooms, growing ferns and other exotics, a site of conspicuous consumption and display, but also care and interspecies relationships. And then Ward quickly sees the potential of the Wardian case to facilitate plant transfers because the sea, salt, and the wind and the lack of water on ships were a big impediment in transplanting desirable plants. And so very quickly, this technology gets picked up and is used in bioprospecting and in moving plants around. And here is where we get closer to tea because, and Romita, please, if I get this wrong, correct me, but one of the kind of major exports of tea out of China by Robert Fortune in the late 1940s was made possible by the Wardian case. Tea seeds are oily and they get rancid over long voyages, so transporting living plants was the only way to really get saplings out of China and eventually into India. And so this technology enabled Fortune as an employee of the East Indian Company to bring tea en masse to other locations for transplantation and eventually plantation economy. And he also brought with it the knowledge of tea cultivation with Chinese experts that accompanied the Wardian cases. Thinking about the artist engaging with this technology that was so important to the mobilization of plants and eventually the mobilization of people through the plantations at scale that it enabled, among other factors. I also was thinking about, and I don't know if you have any observations about the way the plant in the Kiwanga sculpture is staged, elevated, made available in this display, which in some ways mirrors natural history displays, but is also doing other things. And perhaps we can engage a little bit with the mode of display of the fern and what it is doing.
It's definitely taking it out of the private parlors of the Victorian world and into the public, urban 21st century world, but also completely closed off from everybody, right?
Yeah.
So inaccessible at the same time, still inaccessible in that way. It's spectacular.
I'm still stuck on the fact that it's not organic.
Yeah.
I'm still back there like metal. I mean, both because we've been thinking about silver and heat, but I think also, yeah, this notion of creating a pod that seems like it's a climate zone that then in fact is kind of like a sculpture that is it's not necessary for it to be in there in order for it to actually survive. Yeah, I find that fascinating. The Highline is such a wackadoodle environment, though, in general, for this to be just that intersection of public art, but also I feel like so much of that space is supposed to be about New Yorkers getting to see green things. So I kind of love that it's also denying that greenness in a way. Yeah.
And about to launch into space.
Right.
As a completely unliving
Yeah.
theory.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is a tension, right, between its availability and the fact that it's inaccessible to us. She uses dichroic glass, which I didn't know anything about until I saw this sculpture, but it's this very reflective glass that changes color and creates this kaleidoscopic effect. So spectacle has come up, and I think it's making of the plant a spectacle and elevating it and moving it out of the background into the foreground. And then the location, as you said, Jennifer, is very important because if we had zoomed out, we would see the remnants of railroad tracks.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And the High Line is built in the 1930s because we have the trains coming into New York to bring commodities. And what they create is a lot of human fatalities because the train tracks and the people are on the same surface. So you raise the railroad to avoid that, and then the railroad becomes an inefficient way of transporting goods at scale eventually. And through a process of kind of historical transformation, the High Line becomes a public park. But the artist, I think, is very consciously positioning it there to talk about these different temporalities and these different historicities. And the fern is, again, a paradigmatic plant for that because it has a very, very long evolutionary history of hundreds of millions of years. But it's also the source of the fossil fuels that powered modernity. So we have deep time and historical time in the reference to the Wardian case and the future, as you were saying, in this futuristic pod.
And also the sort of epistemic field of botany, and it's all about the jar, right?
Yes.
Not the thing inside it. It's the encasement that brings that attention form of knowledge.
And control.
Yeah.
Would we like to move to this feels like it's setting up some of these.
Yeah, so we're moving backward in time.
Yeah, which I
as a historian, was a little unsettling. But I wanted to think, I was inspired by the sort of jump forward into thinking about some modern artistic reflections on this period, to think through a little bit more systematically the way we've been talking about transportation, preservation, and packaging for tea, and the ways in which every stage of that becomes a place where we can consider forms of resistance. So here we have the tea chest from the National Maritime Museum in London. It's a very lovely tea chest. I don't think the vast majority of tea chests were this nice. But one thing you can notice on it is that first, it's a good reminder to recognize that these are objects, sometimes beautiful objects, that were created in China. So this Chinese material culture that then the American colonists, for instance, will be engaging with in destructive ways. But you can see on the lid of that tea chest, there are two Chinese characters, and those are referencing the firm or broker in China that has produced this batch of tea. And then there's a line, you can't see it very well in this reproduction, but there's a line of smaller characters which will tell you what the species or type of tea is contained in the box. So in this case, it says caper tea. So it's coming from a particular region in China. So on some level, when we're coming out of China in the tea trade, that's what we're bringing out with us, right? Are these boxes of these teas. But in every stage of transit, transshipment across the oceans, and then eventually, if you're coming in through the British East India Company into London and then back out again into the colonies, there are lots of opportunities for laborers on all of the docks and the wharves and in the canoes and various spaces to borrow, pilfer, take parts of that, those commodities for themselves. And unfortunately, I don't have a really great example for pilfering tea particularly, but I have a really excellent one for pilfering rum, which comes from my work in West African British interactions. And there are very interesting politics along the early modern West African coast, in places where the British Royal African Company, in this case, relied on free African local laborers to transport their goods and their people from their ships to the coastline. And that space produces an amazing opportunity to pilfer various trade goods as sort of, part of the cost of taking the canoe. And there's a great 18th century source that refers to one canoe guy who basically stops the canoe maybe 20 feet from the shore with his oar, and he declares that the rum cask has sprung a leak, and then everybody shares a drink from it. Right? So there are various small destructive ways that laborers who are not necessarily being paid large sums of money for their participation in these networks are sort of siphoning off parts of these packages into their own pockets or down their gullets in that particular case. So we have pilfering on the one hand. We have the kind of larger, which we brought up, acts of smuggling. I think it was Carol Shamus who estimated that only a third of the tea going into colonial America was in fact EIC tea. Everything else was smuggled tea from mostly under the category of Dutch in quotations. So that is another form of resistance, again, to imperial hierarchies, to the monopoly structures that were meant to be governing the British Empire in particular. So again, larger sort of structural challenges than perhaps the laborer who's taking a little piece of the goods on their way to the shoreline, but similarly kind of unsettling in the way that plants do themselves, right? Any attempts for the imposition of human notions of order onto the system. So we have smuggling, we have pilfering, and then once we get onto, say, the docks of London, this is a trade card from Durnford and Trollope, who were tea dealers in London in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And they have decided for their trade card that they're going to depict the actual unloading process of tea on the London Wharf. So we're on the south side of the Thames. You can see the London Bridge, and the monument from the Great Fire of London is visible across the river. This was a new dock that had been opened in this period, so it's also kind of a new vista within London, a new urban vista. And one thing I think it brings up is, on the one hand, this is a place where we get the beginning of plant entanglements. You can see on this dock that there's not only tea cases, but there are tobacco caskets or rum casks, sorry, not caskets. There are a lot of deaths from tobacco. Anyway, you can also see that they're sugar, as they call them, sugar loaves. They look like cones, but they're called loaves during this period. So all of those different plant products that are coming together are mixing on the wharves, both in London but elsewhere. And then they are going to be circulating through the warehouses and into retailers and out into London society. And through that process, just looking from the perspective of London, there's a process of adulteration, right? So we have pilfering, we have smuggling, and now we have adulteration. And it is amazing what they adulterated with in the 18th century, so that you don't get the regulation of products until the 19th century. But in the 18th century, all sorts of leaves and dust and detritus got mixed into tea because, tea is sort of brown and leafy, and a lot of other things look like that. Coffee is even more spectacular. People added red clay, they added red dyes, which I find interesting from a kind of artistic painterly perspective. They add horse liver, they add chestnuts, they add acorns, they add chicory, which a lot of people were very upset about when they started to regulate the adulteration processes in the 19th century, because they liked their chicory coffee, as we see in Louisiana in this country. So again, this is a process of resistance, which isn't necessarily overturning, a grand political structure, as Jen was sort of talking about in her introduction, but it's kind of altering and challenging the imperial structures that are the envisioned plan, at least from the perspective of the state. And I'm going to come back and talk about the Betts trade card in a moment, but I think
I love both that notion of companion plans. I'm sitting with that a little bit, but I'm so struck by the ways that, right, we think about commodity as being this kind of stable material thing in some ways, and so I love this idea of tracing these like physical maneuvers that are taking place across space and time that are inherently compromising that status of commodity in different ways. And it's also making me think a little bit, right, about these period ideas about living and unliving, and these kind of ways in which those are problematically tied to race, and how these are also sites, right, where we are seeing the sale of human beings or the transportation of human beings. It's particularly thinking about the West Indies and back to the colonies. There's an infamous example of George Washington exchanging an enslaved man who has been exercising his right to self-emancipation in exchange for rum. So that kind of brutal physical transferability between different quote unquote commodities, definitely, I think, as we think about resistance, there's also that desire to impose, regularity and stasis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I add?
No.
Oh, I was just going to say that, we have this, we still use the language of triangular trade for the Atlantic, at least, and it's really not triangular. I wish we'd get away from that, because over time, even though everything is supposed to come back through London, if we're just considering the British Empire in terms of the fact that they want to be able to tax every product at every point, there are ships coming back and forth from the Caribbean to West Africa, and they are bringing rum to exchange for new people who bring new people who are then enslaved in order to produce the rum. And then the rum goes, so it's a direct transformation of enslaved labor into plant produce, into byproducts of plant produce, back into purchases of enslaved labor. So it's much more direct than we conceive of when we think of it in a triangular format. And should I add that originally in this slide, there was another tea chest.
We cut that one for you.
And I just encourage people, I had not run across this until I was thinking about tea suddenly. There is a Robinson half chest. I don't know if anyone has run across this, but it's in the new Boston Tea Party Ships and Something Museum. And it is supposed to be, at least the story that was handed down through the family that kept this chest, was that a young John Robinson, hence the Robinson half chest, was walking along the beaches in Dorchester at the morning after the Boston Tea Party and collected this broken chest. So we think that this may be our like one actual relic from the act of destruction in the Boston tea in the harbor. So you can, if you Google it, you can find it yourself. There's a lovely sort of family history of it because it was passed down through the generations, and this story of it being important to the American Revolution and obviously to the formation of the memory of the Tea Party is clearly kind of percolating through these generations within this one family, and that's also part of the exhibition at that new museum.
Can I just also tease out the adulteration? Because I thought that was such an interesting way to think about the way about how plants also shape and control bodies. And when we look at images, they're often arrested in the moment where you're lifting the beverage to your mouth. But plants circulate through our bodies, we imbibe them, and that comes with all sorts of anxieties and desires for purity and impurity. And these are also very addictive substances, right? The rum and the opium and the tobacco, and to a certain extent, perhaps tea in the way it creates habits and structures the day. So just thinking about the embodied way, the fully embodied way in which we experience plants, which goes well beyond the visual and is haptic and it's the smell.
You're not going to be surprised, but I'm so obsessed with heat right now, and I've been thinking, right, about the warmth of tea kind of filling your stomach, and I've also I really appreciate your point about kind of thinking about the actual imbibing, because we've gotten to see so many wonderful kind of 18th century conversation pieces that feature people having tea, and they're like, there's never any drinking, there's never any, right? It's always this a before moment of consumption or an after moment of consumption. And I get artistically, it's like really hard to show someone drinking out of a tea vessel. But at the same time, like it feels like we're always missing that crucial piece where tea is entering into bodies. So yeah, I appreciate that so much.
Yeah, that actually kind of leads very nicely into thinking. So one of the things that I've been fascinated with over the years is the way in which plants or other kinds of commodities are vicarious experiences. So we talked a little in the last panel about sort of ideas associated with tea that you are bringing into your body, that there was a lot of thought about that in the 17th and 18th centuries in terms of thinking that the stuff you consume actually transforms you. In some ways in our kind of modern culture, we've gotten away from that, even though it's very literally true. But in the 17th and not true.
Matcha. We've had our matcha moment.
That's very true. But if you look in the trade iconography and the visual culture surrounding the various plant entanglements in London, there's very clear distinctions in the cultural ideas associated with different plants. So this is a very typical, the Betts trade card is a very typical scene that you would find in a 18th century, 19th century London shop card, depicting what it imagines is the origin of the thing it's selling, right? So it's selling not just the tea, but the idea around the tea. And that is still very important to the consumption of tea, right? I mean, we still have those kinds of cultural associations. And you can see there, we have our tea crates. Apparently, I don't read Chinese, but apparently the characters are nonsense. They are just gestures towards characters. They are not, in fact, legible text. But it is imagining this sort of ritual, right? This social ritual that we've been looking at in paintings and other prints represented in terms of colonial or European households, but imagining it in a Chinese context and in this foreign landscape. So I've been interested in the way that different plants bring different imagined cultural and political ecologies into cultural conversations in places where people may have never been to that place, right? So these are all in some level fantasies, although they're rooted in these imperial networks that we've been discussing. And what's noticeable is that you don't find the anxieties that you find around the revolution about feminization. It's very much about the refinement, the civility of Chinese culture. And if you look more broadly in British cultural literature in this period, you can see that it's associated with ideas of the deep origins of human civilization being in the East, and then human populations sort of migrating from the East. In fact, Noah's flood was placed in Asia. So this idea that they are sort of claiming that as a kind of antecedent to European civilization during this moment, And that is wildly different from the kinds of scenes that you get around tobacco plants in particular, which we're going to show in a moment, but also cocoa and other kinds of products. So you can sort of see the way in which this opening up of the world in the early modern period is generative of these new cultural fantasies about the different cultures and practices, and the way that people are kind of appropriating their idea of those practices in order to reconstitute, rethink through the ways of their own practices and cultural characteristics in this period. So it can be a very generative sort of site of conversation and resistance, as we'll see.
Should we see? Would you like to make a tobacco? Gosh, I'm excited for that one.
Yeah.
As soon as you see the green growing thing. But maybe we should pause for a second. Do you want to make that linkage between sort of related commodities, tobacco and tea?
Yeah, sure. So I had too many slides. I was one of those people. And I couldn't decide. I'm actually really glad we've gone this direction, because I had a lot of imagery of that are various versions of what we've looked at in terms of serving enslaved and serving folks, mostly in Britain, serving tea to some kind of intimate domestic setting. But by looking towards tobacco, we actually get to also look at an independent, he was never fully manumitted, so we don't know his status, but we get to look at an individual African in London, Ignatius Sancho, who sold tea. He was not serving tea, he sold tea in his own grocery in Westminster. Unfortunately, we don't have a trade card for him, so I don't know what sort of visual representation he might have made around tea, but we do have his two wrappers, which were, trade cards were like kind of the advertisement for the shop, and tobacco wrappers, you would actually wrap a little parcel of tobacco that you bought at the store would be wrapped in this wrapper, and then you would go off and it would remind you of the shop that you had acquired that product from. So these are his two that he generated for his shop in Westminster in London. And he's an interesting figure. Many of you probably know him. He was born on a slave ship and spent a little bit of time in Spanish America, and then eventually ended up in London. And he ran away when he was 18 from three sisters he was living with in Greenwich, to the Montague family, who we saw yesterday in the Hogarth print. Right? So the Montague family has a very interesting history with almost 20 individual Africans during the 18th century, and he was one of them. So the Duke of Montague was very interested in his literary aptitude, which he helped sort of cultivate. Eventually, Sancho would publish his letters. They would be published posthumously. He also composed music. So he's a very interesting 18th century Black Londoner. And he set up his own shop. The Duke of Montague helped him with that, and he becomes a landowner. So I think he's the second African that we know of who votes in Britain. He can actually vote in an election in Britain. But he generated these two tobacco images to sell his product. And what I find interesting about them is if you look at the array of tobacco wrappers, which I did in my first book and my earliest work, they are fascinating. There are numerous ones that are something you would expect, like this Crofton's Virginia, which is a kind of fantasy of a Virginia plantation where the slaves, who are these hybrid, half Native American, half African figures, are kind of happy, laboring for a white colonist in a plantation. And to give this image its due, at least it recognizes the plantation as the source of the product that's coming into London. Many of the other tobacco wrappers are even more fanciful in that they imagine that the source of that tobacco is a African/half Native American king who's like a trading partner. So it's a commercial relationship, it's completely erasing the plantation. Others sort of emphasize cross-racial sort of sociability. So they show a Black Indian, as it's called in the terminology of the time, smoking with a white Briton. And so there's this variety here. And it's interesting to look at the way Sancho sort of intervenes into this. But he's not necessarily challenging the overarching imperial hierarchies that this is generative of, but he is making his own sort of positionality clear. So if you look at the top one, Sancho's Bastrinadado, he has separated the fused Native American African iconography. And we now have two cherubic children, a Native American who's drinking a beer and smoking a pipe, and an African child who's picking up a tobacco plant. Again, it's because we have no writings from him about his choices in this, or even who made the prints for him. It's very difficult to say what his intention is, but it's very clearly different from the rest of the London iconography at the time. And then the one at the bottom, which is also quite different, but very interesting. It's got Sancho's best Trinidado on the cask, not casket, on the left. So that's his kind of advertisement. And then it's a picture of a Native American figure and a presumably white Briton, and they are kind of shaking hands in this collaborative gesture while they both stand on the French fleur-de-lis. Right, so this kind of anti-French, which is also in his own letters. He's very patriotic in some ways in his writings. But at the bottom of it, it says "the wish." So I feel personally there's some subtlety there. There's not an expectation that this is reality, which is what you see in the other tobacco prints. This is the desirability of a collaborative relationship. So we can question to a certain degree whether or not he's raising a question mark over that, even though he's depicting a fantasy that would appeal to many Londoners, which he's selling his products to.
So looking at time and being sure that we have a chance to talk about the fabulousness that is this, yes. I think maybe we could use that to pivot. We've been thinking about resistance in relation to capitalist commodification and productivity, and ways in which that can be maybe inverted or subverted or shifted to make some space. But we really, I think, wanted to have a chance to bring these themes of kind of anti-colonialism, race, and plant matter together. So I'm very excited. Do you want to introduce this?
I can start, and then we can all sort of chime in. But following on Catherine's also very nuanced attention to how the plantation is present or absent, or is erased or concealed, I think we wanted to end with the afterlife of the plantation in a work by another contemporary artist, Precious Okoyomon, who has worked with a plant that's not intuitively, that doesn't come to mind first when you're thinking of a plantation crop or of economic botany of the period we've been discussing, and that's kudzu, which is known as the vine that ate the South, and has a very interesting history, which is also a reminder that following the movements of plants ties us to very specific environmental histories as well as cultural histories. So kudzu is now an invasive in the United States and especially the American South. And another reason why we wanted to bring in an invasive, thinking about tea, is that invasives are the scandalous alternative to the plant transfers that we've just been talking about at scale. Because when you scale up the movement of plants and people in this modular simplification, in Anna Singh's words of ecosystems, where you erase what was there before and you scale up a production of a monoculture, and then you bring forced labor to work that. What you do often is you deplete the soil of nutrients, you use up all the water, and you end up with an environmental disaster, which is what happened in the American South in the Cotton Belt, and what propelled the FDR's New Deal administration to experiment with kudzu as a remedy for soil erosion. So wherever cotton had been and where the land had been depleted, there was this massive planting of kudzu, which first arrived in the United States as an ornamental plant, and then was tested as a foraging plant, and then became this anti-erosion remedy. So thinking about also the different characters of plants in different contexts, whether it's different epistemic contexts, landscape management, or economic contexts, we end up with kudzu taking off in the American South. And so the artist creates these kudzu gardens, these gardens of an invasive. This is from the Venice Biennale in 2022. And there's not only kudzu in this installation, there's also sugarcane. I think in order to make the argument more legible to an international audience that may not be aware of the kudzu story in the American South, but knows about sugarcane and the plantation economy. There are also other beings here. There is There is soil, there is running water, there are all sorts of critters that come out of the soil, and black swallowtail butterflies that the artist included. So there's this multi-species environment. And to also go back to the body, the experience of walking into the space here after the refrigerated and sterile space of the other galleries was very bracing because you walk into this very humid, warm environment and you become very highly aware of your own body in the space of this garden. And then, of course, the figures in the landscape.
Do we have the detail?
Yeah, we can zoom in.
It's a different detail than I thought. Okay.
It's smaller detail with that. We can go back, but you get and actually this is from an earlier installation, but same. So there is this body of work with the figures made of wool, brown wool, blood, and soil, entitled "Resistance is an Atmospheric Condition," which I think plays into this idea of a political ecology at work here, and how you honor and memorialize the missing brown or the present brown and black bodies in the landscape that we've been thinking about ever since the tour yesterday with the Yale portrait. So just perhaps we can open it up a little bit now, the three of us, and then we can get other reactions. But entanglement is something that you brought up, Catherine. So
yeah, I love the way that you can't tell whether or not the figures are emerging out of the entanglement or if the entanglement is swallowing the bodies. Right? So you get both the human agency and the non-human agency in the same image, which is great.
Absolutely. So there is this co-production with the plant, and the artist is very interested in how the vines are going to engulf the figures and how they're going to take control of the installation, which is sort of a resistance to the fantasy of control of nature and the plant that underlies so much of what we've been discussing.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. I don't want to trample on it. I want to enjoy it. Yeah. Trample. No, I just also love the way that this, very much unlike our Wardian case examples, right, is actually in some ways thinking deeply about that inability to control. And then I think you had spoken really eloquently when we were in conversation about deep time and kind of ways that this forces us to think beyond these like snapshots, not to trash on the semi-sesquicentennial, right? But 250 is such an arbitrary kind of marker, right? And this forces us to think about the realities of these deep temporalities that snapshots kind of can't fully encompass.
And I think we can talk more about temporalities. I think it would be interesting to get into that more. But there is also this question of whether the figure is laboring or not laboring that has come up, and who is doing labor and who is engaging in leisure, and is leisure a kind of labor. But what's interesting to me about the work of Okoyomon is that the figures emerge from the soil, are not working in the sense that we imagine a figure on the plantation working with the plant. And they're more like dancing. They have these graceful movements. So there is this, I think there's also this play with how the body moves and what the body is doing and how free the body is in this invasive garden.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much abundant joy here that it kind of feels like a wonderful place to maybe end and to open things up to the audience for questions or comments or conversation. Ramita's ready.
Thank you. Thank you for a fabulous set of reflections. I love that we started with steam and ended with kudzu. Which just gives us a sense of the broad arc of things that are being discussed. Yota, your presentation, and especially since we have this picture up here, reminded me also of lantana, another invasive species. And that was actually introduced to India and South India through tea plantations, and lantana was introduced as an ornamental. and then takes over like kudzu does. And I don't know if anybody saw the wonderful elephant family, the life-size elephants made out of lantana that were displayed in the meatpacking district, not too far from the High Line. This was sponsored by an entire project coming out of Kerala in India. And interestingly, Queen Camilla is also behind this along with King Charles, because her brother, now deceased, was a huge fan of elephant conservation in India. So they also have been displayed in front of Buckingham Palace. So from Buckingham Palace to meatpacking, to lantana, to back to the tea plantation, and also to the bodies that, and Yota is not going to find this surprising, but I have to mention this. We've talked about human bodies, but I think it's also time to think about the animal bodies that disappear, right, with the massive deforestation that takes place. And animal bodies like the elephant's body, especially, because that will become a laboring body on plantations. Elephants are trained to haul lumber, timber, not only bring down trees, but they're actively used as laborers on plantations in India when those are put into place. Also for surveying land, because you couldn't travel through forest on foot only. You had to travel on elephant back. And what's quite wonderful about that is if you read memoirs, including a memoir written by William Griffith, whose image I showed of that riverine landscape, you realize that they are traveling on elephant back because of the distances that they talk about. There's no way you can see that far out and identify your plants if you're traveling on foot, but you can on elephant back. And the Singpo and Khamti tribes, who are indigenous to Myanmar, who have a whole tradition of tea drinking, by the way, making wild tea into their drink. They use elephants, by the way, to pluck tea from those wild plants. So there's a whole other, I'm just bringing up the elephant as one of the many bodies, but I think as we are bringing up the bodies that disappear in our histories, we need to also keep in mind the multi-species encounters, of course, or interspecies encounters as well. So just wanted to put that out, but thank you for 3 wonderful reflections.
Rita, and the idea also of lantana as being in this space as an ornamental begs the question of which plant is doing work that we want and which plant is resisting that. And perhaps that's something that needs to be teased out with the kudzu as well, that one of the main objections to it is that it interferes with timber plantations, now a different form of monoculture or rendering the landscape productive. And so it's this resistance to the logic of profit. There is a logic of growth here, but it's not the logic of profit and sort of capitalist.
Yeah, we were talking about this, the sort of knottiness of the importation of colonial hierarchy language into plant worlds. So invasive, native, right? All these things that we're meant to be sort of prizing and restoring are constructed categories, and thinking about it in terms of the sort of deeper history as to like why kudzu gets on so well right now in the South, as opposed to thinking of it as invasive, right? I mean, yes. we transplanted it. It didn't come sort of from nowhere, and it flourished because of previous earlier activities on that soil. But it's hard to get away from, because it's invasive. I have a lot of vines in my yard. I consider them invasive. But thinking through, how can we shift this language away from sort of colonial languages of colonization and indigeneity, I think is important to get at thinking through plants to get back to the human. Also, I love the elephant's way of seeing. That's awesome.
Yeah, so awesome.
Thank you so much. I have a question. Speaking of language, going back to the slide with the tea trade cards, and I was just curious if you could say anything more about this process of translation or absence of translation, perhaps, between the Chinese characters and the designation of species and the specificity of labeling tea on a tea chest, and then in the trade card using, made up characters. And because I'm also, this is a limitation of my knowledge, I'm only aware of then in a tea caddy, there being a black tea and a green tea side. So I'm also curious about also maybe like the material translation from the tea chest to the tea caddy and are, especially in this moment of classification and being so interested in botanical drawings and labeling and species, but how aware are people of the kind of variety of tea that they're drinking, or does it just become black tea, green tea? I don't know if there's just anything more to say about that.
It's a great question. I think they're very aware of what they're selling. The smaller characters are usually coming regions, right? They're identifying the regions of China that the tea is coming from, which is usually also the name of the tea. So I don't know. It's not visible in the trade cards. They're not selling. Although we were looking at one yesterday that had green, black, and there was Fuchong or something yesterday. Anyway, it was in the colonial. Was it yours? Yeah. Bohemian. Yeah. So there is some differentiation, at least in the commercial selling material for the tea. How much people individually knew, I guess it depends on what.
But you do have like Southern planters will make specific requests from
specific
manufacturers
regions
or merchants. Yeah. So I do think there's that awareness.
Yeah, I don't think that's always true in like a London grocery. I'm not sure how specialized they would have.
Yeah,
at that
it's
level.
fascinating with the fantasy versus the specificity, right? And I think that gets back to the bodily too in some interesting ways.
Yeah.
Like I think this is both disembodied and also fantastical, right? And so it's operating at the level of commodity circulation as opposed to that bodily engagement. But
They are very well.
At the level of a London grocery. But it's not visible in the anyway.
It's that charm, and they start outlining this. So if you look at the ship auction records as to what they're bringing in, you'll see all of these listed.
Yeah.
Very interesting to see that.
Yeah.
I just want to, so this is Frank. I just want to jump on this particular topic and point out that as far as naming the teas, the origin of the name, whether it comes from the producer side or the consumer side, kind of like the English breakfast, Earl Grey, and Irish breakfast that we were talking about earlier. So these types of names or letters placed on chests and things like that, a lot of times it's written for the benefit of where it came from. It's more for producer's sake, let's say. So that is why, much like the wine industry, you have the Bordeaux and the Champagne, and by the definition of saying Bordeaux, it sort of alludes to a certain level of class, which demands higher pricing and so on and so forth. And that's traced to origin and terroir and vintage and family history and so on and so forth. Same thing with tea. But what is interesting is a name on a chest might indicate a particular region like Darjeeling, like Selambang, like Assam, and so on and so forth. But what's interesting is in purchasing and transfer and commerce and things like that, the British, if you will, or the West aren't really demanding particular regions. They just want a particular style. That's why Irish breakfast, English breakfast, Earl Grey, those are, you can trace back to the emperor or the lord or whoever that liked a particular style, hence the name Earl Grey. There is no Earl Grey region, whereas the naming on the chest usually denotes the origin, whereas the packaging on this side denotes the desire.
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying? So if you sold let's say, a Dongding tea, and in terms of language and translation and things like that, Dongding, it's the name of a famous mountain. But from a strictly marketing standpoint, if you went to Whole Foods and there was a box of tea called Dongding, it doesn't really come off sounding as luxurious or appetizing as, I don't know, Frozen Summit or something like that. Hence it's sort of lost in translation. And
yeah, so I think that's one reason I wanted to draw attention to the Chineseness of the chest. Right? That sometimes we sort of put this all into colonial material culture, but some of this is actually coming from a different system. and where things, apparently the marks are sometimes called chops, and it can either be a particular firm or it can be a batch. So there could be like, 200 chests that are one batch that they've cultivated and grown and processed, that are all the same, that are coming from one firm. So the information is definitely about the production side. And then it gets sort of orientalized when they're depicting the crates in like London imagery. Yeah, absolutely. And some of our biggest companies, like Twinings, still selling tea. It's an 18th century company. So we've inherited directly the categories and things from this period.
Hi. I wondered if we could go back to the Latrobe print that you showed us.
Sure.
I was really struck by that image and wondered if you could tell us more about the forms of thermal resistance you see happening. And there's arson, but maybe there's something more. And when you see, not ascribing intention or anything to Latrobe, but just in this print, it just strikes me like you could just push that urn over, and that the placement of the enslaved person behind the urn, kind of looking on this scene of luxuriant sort of repose, strikes me as a very vulnerable situation. And so wondering how you see those acts of thermal resistance showing up in images.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think one of the things that thinking about heat being produced in these spaces where there are unfree people who are highly skilled in creating heat, sometimes I think about it two ways, that in part the economic ability to afford someone else to create a thermal environment that makes someone else comfortable, if that makes sense, right? Like that in and of itself is a sign of luxury. And I've thought about that more in relation to kind of dining goods at Mount Vernon that are inside in the winter. So things like plate warmers, right? So devices where enslaved people, by definition, using them are encountering heat in ways that are probably bodily uncomfortable, but doing so in ways that ensure, elite white bodies' comfort. So there's always a thin edge, I think, of a performance of someone else's thermal comfort. And then tied within that, I think implicit is a sort of white fantasy of control over enslaved people, right? That one is asserting, as the Washington family, that you are so confident in your ability to dominate others that enslaved people can be given the skill with fire and perform it in front of your guests, but that won't come back and get you, in a sense, is how I'm thinking about it right now. But yeah, these things are like super precarious. They're super damageable. If anybody has a great one in their museum collection that has an intact interior, I would love to see it because they're just beat up. It isn't a great form. So I think the form itself is just inherently kind of precarious. Robert Roberts also talks about how they get musty because they get wet and then they have to be stored. So they have to be stored carefully with paper, stuffed inside. So I also can imagine that these are not fun to be charged with taking care of. Those of you who know Washington know well, he's also just personally obsessed with controlling everything as a person. And so, in some ways, his instructions about the control of fire are really similar to his instructions about the control of all natural resources at Mount Vernon. And so that tension, I think, manifests around heat, but it's definitely present, when Washington tells enslaved carpenters that they have to count the number of nails that they use and then, bring the rest back, right? I mean, he is really committed to material mechanisms of control. His example about arson happening is with enslaved people carrying, in cold winter nights, carrying fire between dwelling places. And he's worried about the sparks that come off, which also tells us a lot, I think, about white comfort and lack of concern for Black comfort. So yeah, I would love to talk more about this image, though, if you want to find me. We are keeping people from lunch, and we are very aware of that fact. So I just want to thank both of you. This has been so fantastic. Thank you.